Hi, it's Steve Hargadon, and welcome to the Future of AI. It's Friday, August 16th, 2024, and Reed Hepler is here. Hello, Reed.
Hello. Hello.
Okay, so again, another fascinating week. I feel like this is the week of disillusionment with large language models. A lot
Uh-huh.
of the stories I read are people being much more realistic about what large language models can actually do. I feel like you and I have talked about this and thought about it quite deeply. Their language, not logic, and
Uh-huh.
that they're shaped, definitely trained in specific ways, and that they represent an enormous degree of informational power.
Yes.
So
Uh-huh.
that those who are in control of them are likely to be sort of controlling general narratives. Um, so let's start with some news. We'll go back and forth here. Do you want to start with your CNBC story?
Yes. So this is really interesting, and it speaks to what you were talking about the person who controls or manipulates the content of the AI, controls the narrative. JP Morgan Chase has essentially, I don't know if they force people, but they are offering it or giving it to all of their employees, an artificial intelligence assistant. It's created by OpenAI. It's a chat bot. I don't know that much about the workings of it because I obviously don't work at JP Morgan, but it's an assistant and it is an app. It's called LLM Suite, and which is kind of a generic term, but basically it's a massive large language model, custom GPT. It's an app that they download on their computers, and the software helps with all sorts of stuff: emails, writing reports, analyzing data, all sorts of things. It's basically kind of what we've been talking about with the professional productivity, but is essentially being forced on their employees, and it's by JP Morgan. It's like a JP Morgan Chase branded thing for internal use. And so, speaking of companies and people in charge of AI tools being, controlling the narrative, they're basically saying, here's a standardized way to make your emails, to make your things. And so, really, really interesting that they're providing their own. It's by OpenAI, but it's not ChatGPT. It's something different than that. That JP Morgan is saying you will use this tool and you do not use other tools, and stuff like that. So
So that's probably close to what we're doing when we do a custom GPT, right? So
yeah,
we're putting a certain set of documents in or something in and saying, hey, we want to give specific instructions. And we're going to shape the instructions so that the correspondence matches a certain kind of professionalism and the like, which is interesting because it still leaves room for error.
yes,
And
yeah,
it is shaping the narrative within the organization, which is this whole sort of own interesting 1984 like kind of scenario where really how much are you bringing your own personality and inventiveness to the job, and how much are you
yeah.
just walking around behind AI, holding a leash behind AI. Um, and it's not really the large scale narratives that you and I have worried about a little bit, which is kind of the shaping of the news or news stories or politics. But it is interesting to see that for a large company now, there's a very practical pathway to increased profitability with the use of AI. So if individuals are getting disillusioned with the AI results of AI, or even smaller companies are saying, "Hey, this isn't helping as much as I thought it would help," both uh, a large financial company like this, and then also Walmart announced, I think today or yesterday, that they increased they were able to do a job with a database updating of product stock that was 100 times more efficient than using humans.
Yeah. Oh, yep. Okay. They're calling it element, apparently. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's some dramatic gain in productivity. So this is not a huge surprise, right? That the beneficiaries of the AI are going to be those companies that can leverage the manpower and the thinking power to create a solution that really does improve efficiencies. And weirdly enough, probably makes it harder for the small business person to compete against the large corporations if they have the power of AI behind them.
Yes, that's true. Um, and so you do have to think about those dynamics, all the different power dynamics. What if the AI, the employee or the consumer uses the AI that's provided by the company in a way that the company doesn't like, but it was the AI that did it because it was in, and so that all these human-centered considerations you have to think about when you're dealing with AI and providing AI and assessing its use. And that's kind of the theme, I think, of this week is kind of the balance of power that's being supported or disrupted by who's using AI for what purposes, um, all sorts of stuff. Yeah, so really interesting there.
So there was an enormous data breach. I don't know if you've gotten news of this, but I think it was over 2 billion people's records that came out of a company from Florida that scraped personal information to do
Yes.
checking on information. So again, that's just kind of a reminder. I mean, whatever the number was, it was 2+ billion people, but it was social security numbers, full names, addresses, the kinds of things that you get asked in security questions
Yeah.
that make you realize, okay, so no matter how much these companies are promising privacy, there's
It's
still
never.
never an ultimate guarantee that that's going to be the case.
Yeah. Yeah.
A story I wanted to focus on a little bit was Google's next Gemini move. I haven't gotten the next
Oh,
Gemini live update,
okay.
but they say it's coming, and I have a Samsung phone, and so I'm likely to
Oh,
get it
nice.
quickly.
Okay.
But it feels to me very much like they're moving in the direction, or at least partially in the direction of Apple. We want to create very tangible, practical things that you can do by voice interaction. So it will interface with your specific apps and the tasks that you would do on your phone, and that makes a lot of sense to me.
Uh-huh.
That, and I think Apple. My current belief is that Apple is going to end up looking very good for having been so focused on actual productivity in addition to privacy.
Uh-huh. Well, they're more segmented. It's like it's AI enhancement of specific apps rather than one AI that connects with everything that, all these things. And who knows? It could be that Google does have a discrete Gemini thing for every app, but that's not what they're saying. That's not what it's looking like. So that's really interesting. And it's kind of the say it's literally it is an AI agent that works through your apps for you. It's an AI agent that is it's basically what Rabbit tried to be, which I haven't. I'll have to look at Rabbit. I can report on that next week. But Rabbit seems to be dying. Nobody really likes it anymore. Um, so anyway, but it seems to be that AI manipulating other apps for users seems to be it is the future of AI, at least for consumer products. I don't know about other things, but for consumer products. So interesting. And we talked a little bit about at the beginning of like the disillusionment of consumers related to LLMs, but is it really LLMs that they're disillusioned for, or is it LLMs that don't do other things? Like I think that Gemini AI, it's still, well, it's using an LLM interface, so you're interacting with it as an LLM, but then it's doing other things behind the scenes. So
Yeah.
it or I mean, then we have, and we can talk about this. We'll talk about it later. The voice, ChatGPT's voice mode, where you like to speak with AI more rather than typing with it. I even with the voice to text that I do, if I still prefer typing it, but a lot of people are liking the voice mode, so it'll be interesting. Um,
I've been using the voice mode with Perplexity and
okay,
with ChatGPT. I like Perplexity a little bit better because I can hold down the button so that it knows when I'm done talking rather than assuming that I have finished.
okay.
But I don't yet have the new 4.0 version of ChatGPT, which is supposed to be so incredibly human-like in its responses.
It and that's why OpenAI was kind of warning people about, don't get attached to our voice mode because it could cause you emotion. Like they actually said, it could cause you emotional harm because you
Mhm.
could get too connected to it. It's
Yeah.
bizarre.
Well, they keep
And
pushing the data.
that's even after they remove Scarlett Johansson's voice. So whatever voice they have, it's apparently going to be very, um, I don't know,
I
interesting.
think this is a very real issue. It's the cognitive triggers, the things that make us feel feelings. So I think may in part be responsible for why AI keeps pushing dates back, both their 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 guesstimates of when there will be increases in intelligence levels,
Uh-huh.
but also they've certainly pushed back the release of that promise. when they did that demo the day before the big Microsoft event,
Yeah.
it really felt like it was going to be tomorrow, that we would see all of that tomorrow. And now not only have they pushed back sort of the data and the voice, but I actually think that the interaction with the image part has been indefinitely pushed back. So
Yeah.
I'd
Yeah.
love to check on that.
Well,
But anyway, lots getting pushed back.
yes, yes. Well, and it's interesting because they say they're releasing things. I know that there are two influencers on LinkedIn especially who are they talking about the search GPT, talking about the voice, talking about the vision mode, I think is what it's called with the images. And they're they're talking about things that most people aren't accessing. So why are you talking about them right now? But it's just it seems to be that they're accenting or for strengthening kind of the digital divide. It's like the haves and the have-nots, but then there's also the have before everyone else type thing, which I guess is how all technology is released. You have to have your demos, but it seems to be they're delaying the release. They keep pushing it back. They keep changing what they're going to do. A lot of people are saying like your first promises with this were so sci-fi, and they were always sci-fi when really the initial promises weren't sci-fi at all. But it just seems to be that there's an issue of transparency, and then there's also the issue of people distorting the claims of the companies before, where like you promised all of these things when in reality they promised half of them, and then the other ones were either implied but not stated, which we can talk about the ethical considerations of that, or they were just assumed by the consumers. And so, anyway, really interesting, really, and again, more power struggles, more relationship between the consumer and the provider, or in the case of of companies, of institutions, if your institution is controlling your AI or administering your AI between the administrator and the consumer and the creators. And so this is why I think, and I wrote a blog about this. It really was kind of a mashup of my previous blog posts, but I called it human-centered considerations when creating and using AI tools. And so I talk about this. I have a post that I share, and that was my previous post of like kind of human-machine interactions. But I wanted to focus on the fact that you need to think about a lot of different topics before you ever start working with AI tools. And so I talk about some of the issues that we need to, like the concepts you need to think of when you're making custom AI tools. And then I give some examples. I give you some excellent examples by Dr. Denise Turley. I don't know if you've heard about her. She releases demonstrations. She's the vice president of the United States Chamber of Commerce. So really interesting. She talks about using AI in business, and I gave 2 demonstrations on that. But it's just, you need to think about these things and make sure that what you're doing is actually ethical and that it's going to work. And I think a lot of people are forgetting that, especially these companies. I would be really interested to see JP Morgan Chase, how that works out for them. They won't probably release the data, but I would hope that they're training their employees to think about these things. They need to really, have a plan for your conversations and not just, make this and then it fails and then, oh, this is awful, or make this and then it puts out harmful material and they copy and paste them without thinking, or, stuff like that. So that was my blog post.
So I do think that we are seeing kind of play out the theme that you and I have discussed, which is that AI is likely to get integrated into the programs and things that we're doing more than we need to be treating it as a separate thing, right? So the command line use of large language models has been fascinating and fun, but it's likely to just get integrated in. So Google integration into the Google Office suite, Microsoft's integration into their Office suite. These are likely just to become kind of a part of the landscape. They're just part of how we operate and work now. But it is important to recognize. So again, all of our stories are posted at news.futureofai.org. But there was a story called "Why AI's Tom Cruise Problem Means It's Designed to Fail." So the Tom Cruise problem is, if you ask AI who Tom Cruise's mother is, it will give you her name. But if you ask who's the son of that woman, the name, it won't tell you Tom Cruise. That
Huh.
there's something inherently difficult for AI because it's based on language prediction. So
Okay.
often there would have been cases where they talk about Tom Cruise's mother, but there would never have been very many cases where they were focusing on the mother and talking about her son. So
Okay.
the great bulk of the large language frequency is going to be one direction and not the other, and that the it's a proof that the model doesn't have a good capability of actually reasoning, because you'd say if Tom Cruise is so and so's son, who's who is the mother of Tom Cruise, right?
Yeah.
That they can't go both ways.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
I thought
You
that was
can't.
really interesting, and again, a
Okay.
reminder that because these are so fluent and they sound so good, we're going to be lulled into a little bit of complacency that we're getting all the answers. I do know for myself that I will get answers from Perplexity or Claude or ChatGPT
Uh-huh.
about something, and I will then ask the question in a different way to try and get more information or a different response.
Mhm.
Or I will say, um, I know something about the topic, and so I'll say, well, given this particular thing, and it's not infrequent that the whole story changes. And I realize, okay, this is not an encyclopedia. It's not a
No.
robotic encyclopedia. This is a very fluent language model. It's super helpful, but
Mhm.
it should not be your end result.
Well, and more people, this reminded me of a news story that I read yesterday, are getting fired for assuming that the AI knows things. There was a reporter, I believe it was somewhere in Chicago, that he wrote a newspaper article. He written several newspaper articles. He was a novice, freshly out of college, and he wrote an article, and his articles were containing completely made up stuff, made up quotes from AI tools. And I think that the newspaper would have smiled more upon it if it was, his words or his stuff that was AI tools, but it was AI quotes. So instead of going and interviewing people, he was asking AI what they might say, and they said things, and obviously it's not correct, and so he got fired. And so, in fact, and then the Washington Times did like a whole ad. It was like, uh, basically like we always check our sources, or we never use AI sources, look at us. And so it's just, and then you have that, the lawyer who had his cases. That was a little while ago, but a lot of people are still, even they still are using faulty AI literacy and treating it, like you said, as an encyclopedia. And I really like that Tom Cruise issue. I would have assumed that it would have gotten fixed by now, but it hasn't apparently. And that does demonstrate AI can't do tautologies. AI can't do deductive reasoning. And that's literally like kind of the benchmark for basic logic and basic debate skills, um, and arguments. So anyway, really interesting.
Okay. Anything else you want to talk about with regard to the news?
Well, I did have one kind of clincher at the end, um, and this is kind of a CNN business thing, and CNN business is more opinion than anything else, but it talks about that brands should avoid,
Yeah.
talking about their AI, um, their AI enhanced stuff. Um,
Well, wasn't it
it's
that
not
they
true,
actually got a
or
negative response to it? Like they wouldn't buy a product if it said it was AI related?
yeah, yeah. It said tacking the AI label on products may actually drive, well, it said may actually drive people away. I don't know if that is true, but I do think that it's at least misleading. So even if it isn't driving people away, then even if they do buy it, they're going to become disillusioned with it because AI implies to the consumer that everything is going to be so amazing, and not necessarily. I mean, with my sprinkler system uh, is is technically AI powered, and it makes mistakes all the time. So, and that, well, to be fair, that was like rudimentary AI. I think it was like 2017 when it was installed. But I mean, I think part of the problem is the consumers. But fact is, companies when they either it's JP Morgan talking to employees or Sony talking to their TV buyers, their people who buy their TVs, they need to be careful with the AI label, not only because I mean it could have AI, it could very well have AI, but the assumptions that come, the correlation, I guess, that comes with it is dangerous because it could cause them a lot of issues in their reputation and in their reviews. So anyway, so that's the end of the news.
Okay. Again, for me, the theme of the week has been a little bit of an awakening to uh, the imperfections of large language models and a little bit of the sheen coming off,
Mhm.
the wished for thinking. Still amazing tools in my mind, but not what we were being promised. And again, you and I have talked quite a bit about the incentive or motivation for companies to produce something, both in their demos and in their descriptions, to make it seem like something is ahead of where it is in order to gain market position or to be selling. So I think that's just something to be continually aware of.
Uh,
Okay, anything we want to dive deep on?
we were going to talk about ChatGPT voice mode. And we talked a little bit about this in the other things, but do you have anything else, I guess, to add about ChatGPT voice mode? A lot of different opinions on that.
I just wish that I had it. I mean, I have the voice on, but I wish I had that new sort of super fluent one that when we were promised that we saw the videos about,
Yeah,
right? And the
like
story
2 or 3 months ago.
voices. Yeah, yeah. So we'll save that for the future. I
Okay.
will say that Perplexity has become my uh, my tech assistant.
Okay.
It's shocking. Every time I have an issue with something where I want to figure out how to do it, whether it's in a spreadsheet or it's trying to where I would normally spend 10 minutes to an hour researching online to find something, I just ask it, and you can watch it go through. It has this little thing where it tells you where it's looking and what sources it's going to, and it goes to Reddit, and it's doing the work that I would normally have done to find the answers. And this again has just turned out to be enormously productive for me. So I know it's not super glamorous or glitzy, but Perplexity is letting me get things done in a way that I really appreciate.
Yeah, awesome. I have to, and you told me about Perplexity about 2 months. I mean, I knew about Perplexity, but you talked to me about its benefits 2 months ago, and I've used it, and I think there's a lot of potential there, and I've used it a lot of things. I just have the free version, but it's really, really exciting to think about that. It'll be interesting to see how Perplexity does when compared with Search GPT and how things, because I guess with the way that they look at the internet and stuff. So yeah, a lot of different things, a lot of different perspectives. This has been a fantastic week for news and releases. So
Thank you, Reed.
thank you very much.
Okay, bye now.